In this video, I'm going to move away from talking about types of research, like quantitative and qualitative research, at least for a little while, and spend some time focusing on the overall quality of a study, and what makes a study good and what makes a study bad. And it turns out that the overall quality of a study has two dimensions to it. The overall quality of a study can be described in terms of its internal validity or in terms of its external validity. So imagine two separate number lines, one for internal validity and one for external validity, and a certain study will fall somewhere on the internal validity line and also somewhere on the external validity line. Now, a really terrible study would be low on both, and a really excellent study would be high on both. But a study could be low on one and high on the other. For example, a study could be low in internal validity and high in external validity, or a study could be low on both. And I wanted to share a quick analogy that I think might help you understand how the overall quality of a study has two dimensions to it. So if you think about it, the quality of a restaurant has two dimensions to it. And those two dimensions are service and food. So a certain restaurant will have a certain level of service quality and a certain level of food quality. And a restaurant could be low on both. It could be bad food and bad service. It could be high on both, great food and great service. Or it could be low on one and high on the other. And in the same way, the quality of research study has two dimensions to it, internal and external validity. Now let's define these two terms. So internal validity is the ability to reach a cause and effect conclusion. So a study that's high in internal validity is capable of supporting a cause and effect conclusion. And if a study is high in internal validity, it doesn't mean that the researcher's hypothesis about cause and effect will be supported. It just means that the study is capable of supporting a cause and effect conclusion. So imagine for a moment that I do that experiment that I've been talking about. I do an experiment in which one group is in a hot room and one group is in a cold room, and both groups take the same recall test. Now imagine that the hot group does do significantly worse than the cold group. If I can, as a researcher, can confidently say that the hot temperature is what caused the hot room to do worse, and that the cause is not something else, then I have high internal validity. It means that my study was designed in a way that allows me to confidently draw a cause and effect conclusion at the end of the study. And external validity is the ability to reach conclusions about people, places, and times that were not actually observed. It's the ability to make generalizations beyond what you've actually observed. So I wanted to give a real life example or real life situation for you to think about that I think will help you understand these terms. So imagine you're walking across campus at your university and you see a student dropping some books on the ground. And you see that 5 other people walk right by that person and don't offer to help. All 5 people just walk right by that person. Well, if you can confidently say what caused those 5 people to be unhelpful, then you have high internal validity. You as an observer have high internal validity. You can confidently reach a cause and effect conclusion about what you observed. But if you can confidently say that that same unhelpfulness would happen elsewhere, like in a work environment or at a shopping center, then you have high external validity, right? Because you are able to go beyond what you've observed and reach conclusions about external setting. So yeah, that's internal and external validity. So I want to talk for a moment about where these terms internal and external come from. So if you have internal validity, you can confidently say what caused the behaviors that occurred inside your study. You can confidently say what caused the behaviors in the internal bubble of your study, the time and place of your observations. External validity is when you can confidently reach conclusions beyond the bubble of your study in external settings that you've actually haven't observed. So now I want to talk about the types of studies that tend to be high in internal and the types of studies that tend to be high external. And before we move on, I wanted to mention that there is actually a trade-off between internal and external validity. So a study that's high on one tends to be low on the other. It's very difficult to do a study that's high on both. And I wanted to explain why. So the more variables you control in a study, the more things you control, the more internal validity you have. So if you're doing a study in a highly controlled setting like a lab, you're likely to have higher internal validity. That's because by controlling things, you're eliminating other possible influences on the behavior that you're observing, and you're able to pinpoint the true cause more clearly. So imagine for a moment that we do that study. Imagine for a moment that we do that recall experiment that I've been talking about with the hot room and the cold room. Now imagine that, that I, as a researcher, ensure that the two groups are tested at the same time of day, that they eat the same breakfast, that both groups have had the same caffeine intake, that both groups are given the same amount of time to memorize the items, and that they're given the same directions, and that they're tested in the same noise level in the same room, and that let's say I test both groups in a soundproof room. If I've controlled all of these variables, I'm going to have high internal validity, because if the cold group does better, if the cold group does better than the hot group, I'm going to be able to confidently say that the temperature is what caused the difference in performance, because what else could it be? The two groups, it can't be time of day, it can't be noise, it can't be caffeine intake, because I've controlled all of those things. So I do have high internal validity, but at the same time, this control that's giving me this high internal validity is also lowering my external validity, because the more control I have, the more artificial the situation becomes. The situation becomes less like the real world, which makes it difficult for me to draw conclusions beyond my study, beyond the time and place and people of my study. Because in the real world, things are a lot more messy, and they aren't as controlled. In the real world, it's not always a soundproof room, it's not always 9 a.m., and it's not always caffeine-free, which means if I've only tested people at 9 a.m. in a soundproof room with no caffeine, it's going to be hard for me to say things about the real world. My situation is pretty artificial. So if I did that highly controlled study that I just described, and the hot group does significantly worse than the cold group, like I predicted, I'm going to be able to confidently say that the temperature of the room is what caused one group to do better than the other inside my study. I have high internal validity, but at the same time, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for me to reach a conclusion like students should take their exams in an air-conditioned room. It's going to be hard for me to back up that type of claim, because I haven't tested real-world situations. I've only tested an artificial situation. If I took the results of my study and I went out and I started claiming that universities should air condition their rooms during exams, they're probably going to say to me, well, your study isn't very much like the real world. It's very controlled. So I don't really believe that your results are really saying anything about what happens during exam settings. And it turns out that in psychology, researchers have traditionally favored internal validity over external validity. So researchers have tended to do highly controlled studies to confidently reach cause and effect conclusions, even at the expense of realism and making generalizations to the real world. But that's just kind of a tradition in psychology. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying that all psychology research is controlled and artificial, because in psychology there is non-experimental research, there is survey research, but in general, psychologists have favored internally valid studies over realism, just as tradition. It's just kind of a tradition that's been passed down. So now what I want to do is I want to explain what types of studies tend to be high in internal and what types of studies tend to be high in external. So at this point, you might have guessed that experiments tend to have high internal and low external because experiments are controlled in controlled settings, controlled environments, which leads to confidently pinpointing cause and effect, but having low realism. And you might have already guessed that non-experimental studies like survey studies tend to have the reverse, high external and low internal, right? Because in non-experimental studies, you're collecting data about real world situations, and you have realistic observations, but at the same time, you don't have a high level of control, and the environment that you're observing is very messy, which means you can't pinpoint cause and effect conclusions very confidently, and you have low internal validity. If you go to a shopping center or a restaurant and observe behavior, you're probably going to have high external validity because you're observing people in a real life setting, and you're going to be able to probably confidently generalize to other real world settings. But at the same time, you're not going to have any confident cause and effect conclusions.